Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of The Classical Republican. Today, we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of classical republicanism. Well, first of all, Philip Pettit states that there are 3 main points that constitute classical republicanism. First is the mixed regime. Second is liberty as non-domination. And the third is citizen participation. To begin with the mixed regime, it goes all the way back to Aristotle. In his Politics, he talks about different governments. Now, he says that there are basically 3 types of governments. You have rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. And you have a good version and a bad version. So, rule by the one would be a righteous king, a good monarch. King or queen, doesn't matter. The bad version would be a tyrant. So you can have a very good king, you can have a tyrant, there's still monarchy, ruled by the one. Then you have rule by the few, and for good, you have aristocracy. Now, we live in a time when aristocracy is really a bad term. But in Greek, it means rule by the best. So the best out of everybody in your political entity is in charge, is making the law, is ruling. So that was seen as a good thing. There's another word, and that is oligarchy. Oligarchy usually has a bad term. Not always. I mean, there is, it's ruled by the rich, the powerful. They're looking out just for their own interests, while aristocracy is really trying to figure out what's the best for everybody in the political entity. Then we have rule by the many. And we think of democracy today as being really good. I guess for a bad term, you would say a mobocracy. So that's bad. So a group you get a majority together, and they're not thinking of what's good for everybody. They are just, terrible majority rule. So they're going to harm minorities, take away their rights, and just do what that majority thinks is good for them. All right. So, out of all these, which one was the best according to Aristotle? And he said it was the righteous monarch. Because if you have one person who's doing one thing, doing the best that he can do, and he's the best person out of your whole political entity, then that is the best form of government. But how long does that last? It doesn't last, it'll last a generation, maybe 2 if you're lucky. But eventually the line, and even we saw this in Rome among the Caesars when you had the emperors, even they degenerated. And you had a terrible monarchical rule. He didn't think much of democracy either. So if you wanted something that is second best to the righteous monarch, but is still a good thing that will last a long time, that will provide stability over the long term, then he said that your best option is a mixed regime of all three. Okay? Because you might have a good, you can't have all bad elements. Most likely you won't. Otherwise your whole society is just on the downfall. So you have a mixed regime. And that's what he said was the best form of government. And that is what became to be known as the Republic. Okay, he called it the mixed regime. Sometimes it gets translated as polity, because he was really talking about this form of government going on in a Greek city-state. So it wasn't he wasn't thinking that, a big empire or a big, some type of kingdom. He was thinking about the city-state that was popular in Greece during the time that he lived. Okay, so this is not an ideal government, but it is a government that we can have. It is possible. It implies checks and balances, though he never used the term. But he is clearly talking about strong institutions and not allowing one to dominate over another. Now, going on to the second element, liberty as non-domination. That means liberty as non-domination as opposed to non-interference. Okay, this is referring back to Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Theories of Liberty. And he says that you have liberty as non-domination, meaning that you don't have a power over you that is limiting you. And then there is also liberty as non-interference, meaning maybe you do have powers over you, but they don't really interfere with you. They don't get in your way. But they can. They have the power to. They have the authority or whatever. Now, Republicans, classical Republicans, choose non-domination. They feel that it is wiser to have non-domination rather than non-interference. Now, this is in contradistinction to most liberals, and I'm talking about classical liberals, Hobbes and Locke, and so most of of political discourse today in the United States, in Western Europe, in what they call the West, would be called liberalism, classical liberalism, possibly neoliberalism. That would be more of a that would be a modern take on Reagan and Thatcher. And then later, you saw more left-wing parties choosing neoliberalism with Tony Blair in the UK and Bill Clinton in the US. They were New Labour, New Democrats, and they were they were on the neoliberal bandwagon. So classical republicanism opposes that version of liberty, the non-interference. And even Isaiah Berlin would have agreed, possibly, had he not lived under the Cold War, during the Cold War era, because he was presenting this as a way of understanding liberty and a way of understanding how best to pursue liberty during the Cold War. And he suggested, in his thesis, he said you need to have a balance. But he said that if you have to choose one, and we probably need it more so now, meaning back during the Cold War than ever. It is non-interference. He felt that non-interference would bolster the West and hinder the communists in the Eastern Bloc, and that's what happened. The Eastern Bloc fell apart, and so we have the dominance of non-interference as the ideal liberty, the ideal form of liberty. Okay, so in classical republicanism, we actually reject natural right. We're not saying it's a bad thing, but it is that you don't have those rights unless they are backed by government force. So you are free because of, not in spite of government. And a lot of libertarians and today would say that you are free, you are just free, and you were born free, and the government just needs to protect that freedom. So that that seems like an ideal that isn't exactly attainable. There are people in say in North Korea, maybe they're not free, but a libertarian would say that they have their natural rights. Well, what good are those natural rights if the government doesn't honor those rights and takes away those rights? Okay, moving on to number 3, citizen participation. Now, this means different things to different classical Republicans in different places at different times. So I'm going to be very vague here, but there's always some sort of element where citizens have a chance to voice their opinions and to have that be calculated into policy formulation. Before the 1700s, this also meant sortition. There's a long tradition of sortition. That means random selection of people to come together and make decisions. And that really fell away after the 1700s, and nobody really talked about. Really in the Enlightenment, nobody talked about sortition. And if they were talking about democracy, they were making fun of it and making fun of the use of sortition. Today, we think of citizen participation as elections, being able to vote, and sortition has made a comeback in the last few decades, and we've seen it in some parts of the world, such as in Europe, in Australia, and we've seen it in the United States and Canada. Most recently, I believe in Washington State, they had a climate council that was formed using sortition. Aristotle said that citizens need to rule and be ruled in turn. So that was so frequent elections. Term limits are also very important to classical Republicans. And so we think of this as serving as a magistrate or on a council. That's what we have in mind. It also includes, and we still use this today, jury service and military selective service, and there are a few other minor situations where we use sortition. A controlled hunt, for example. It's a lottery. So those are forms of sortition that we still use in classical republics. Venice, for example, sortition was used regularly on a limited basis. And then, of course, term limits were also very important. Usually before the before the Enlightenment, terms, if you had them, if you weren't elected for life, your term was 1 1 year, maybe 3 years, but we're talking short terms here. Now, this democratic element does not mean that we support majoritarianism. We're actually against majoritarianism when we're making decisions as a whole. The whole state coming together and saying, the majority believe this, so we should do this. That's not something that should be that should be supremely honored. That should not be something that holds the ultimate weight of that state's decision to do something. So that's why we have checks and balances. That's why it's so important to have checks and balances to be considered a classical republic. They are in place. Checks and balances are in place to prevent all kinds of tyranny, including tyranny of the majority. So these are the basic principles. There are others that are very important, that are particularly rooted in classical republicanism. Although I would give you a caveat that that classical liberalism kind of broke off from classical republicanism, and became its and took a lot of that in places like France and the United States of America. So a lot of those regimes are mixed in the way that you have you have a lot of classical republicanism, especially in the 1789 Constitution of the United States, and then you also have a good hunk of a classical liberalism, for example, in our Bill of Rights. Now, we have the other things that are also important. You have the rule of law, and that's the rule of law for common good, the common good of the state. You have due process, that kind of comes out of checks and balances. So you have a decision being made. Now, it may not be through majoritarianism, it may not be through something else, but you have a norm that everyone recognizes that this is the way that we come to decisions. So there's not an arbitrary decision made. Somebody just didn't, come out of left field and say, no, we're going to do it this way because I said. So due process is very important. Also, equality of opportunity. I'm going to be kind of vague on that too, because depending on where and when you're talking about with classical republicanism, but there is always an emphasis on equality of opportunity. It can go so far in, say, like a modern capitalist society where supporting economic equality of opportunity, everybody having an opportunity to make the same, take the same risks or whatnot, to go into a profession, to go into a certain job, to spend their money with the same opportunities as everybody else. But then you have people like James Harrington, who believes that there has to be a land redistribution to start off with equality of opportunity, concerning the economic equality of opportunity. Now, there's also equality of opportunity in politics. So that can mean everyone has the chance to vote. That can mean everyone has a chance to run for office. So that is very important to classical Republicans. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to say that these principles can be applied under various economic systems. It can be you could have a socialist republic as long as you have these elements of a mixed regime with checks and balances, liberty as non-domination, and citizen participation. And then you can have a capitalist society. Republicanism works very well under capitalism too, but it also predates capitalism, so it's not wedded to any certain economic system. So these are not just good ideas to use in a political structure. These are not simple tools of good governance. They are those things. They are good tools. They are good principles for good governance. But they are also principles that we have to live by. Principles that we have to fight for if we don't have them. And fight to defend them if we do. Fight to preserve them. These are things that will help you and the people of your political entity to achieve their potential, their full potential, and their happiness in accordance with the as the ancient philosophers described. So that's all I have today. I would like to encourage you to like and subscribe this video if you're watching on YouTube. And check me out on Patreon. And I hope to see you next time. Long live the Republic.